Before we start today's episode, I'd just like to point out that this incident is a bit more complex than the videos that I usually do. It took me a few readings of the accident report to get a tentative grasp on the incident. If you find my explanation to be lacking in any way, please do take a look at the final report in the description. I'll try my best to explain what happened in the simplest way possible. This is the story of the Madrid Runway Disaster. When you usually think of an air crash, you think of a plane on fire falling out of the sky. That's the default image in all of our minds, but as we'll see today, that's not always the case. Today we'll be looking at an old air crash that's almost been forgotten by the pages of history that throws this paradigm out the window. Madrid's Barajas airport is one of the most busiest in Europe. It's just 10 kilometers away from the financial hub of Madrid. This means that the airport copes with massive amounts of cargo and passengers each year. In 2018, the airport moved almost 58 million passengers. Not bad at all when you consider that Heathrow moved about 80 million passengers. Back in 1983, the airport was busy for its time. And on the 7th of December 1983, all that hustle and bustle would claim lives. On the ground that day was an Iberia Boeing 727 with 84 passengers on board, heading to Roma Fiumicino Airport. The plane was loaded with about 14 tons of fuel for its journey. Another plane was busy preparing for takeoff as well, an Aviaco DC-9 headed to Santander Airport. The plane was busy taking on its 37 passengers and 5.6 tons of fuel that it would need for its flight. The plane was 33 minutes late due to bad visibility. The morning was foggy. It was early in the day and visibility was low. The pilots on that day would have a hard time with visibility, hovering around the 100 to 200 meter mark. They'd have to be alert. The conditions were eerily similar to that of the Tenerife crash. The accident had occurred just 6 years ago, and it might have been fresh on the pilots' minds. At 8:33 a.m., the crew of the DC-9 requested for their taxi clearance. The visibility wasn't doing them any favors. Visibility, which was at 200 meters at 8 a.m., was now down to 100 meters. The DC-9 had been given the route that they needed to follow. Right when the DC-9 begins to taxi, the Iberian 727 contacts ground control. They're ready to taxi as well. They're given their taxi instructions, and they begin their taxi. The airport at the time had two runways, runway 01 and 33, but runway 33 was out of commission for takeoffs today. Runway 33 was only to be used for landings due to the low visibility. The fog pressed up against the window panes of all the planes on the ground that day, and the pilots struggled to see out. They peered into the gray expanse, trying to make sense of the environment around them. As the 727 taxis away to hold short of runway 01, the DC-9 was approaching a 5-way taxiway junction. They had to get to taxiway Oscar 5, which meant that from this junction they had to take a right onto taxiway Oscar 07, and then head straight onto taxiway Oscar 05, which would put them behind the Iberian 727. You can now see the planned route of the DC-9 on your screen marked in green. At 8:37 a.m. and 10 seconds, the 727 is ready to go. The tower asks them to line up and wait on runway 01. At 8:38 and 32 seconds, the tower gives the 727 the all clear. They were good to go. The engines on the 727 ramped up to full power as the plane started to lumber down the 3,700 meter or 12,000 feet long runway. The ground controller asks the DC-9 if they've reached Oscar 5, and the crew of the DC-9 was to contact ground control once they reached Oscar 5. The crew of the DC-9 suddenly realized that they weren't on a taxiway anymore. They realized that they were on an active runway, runway 01 to be precise. The pilots, realizing their error, throw the plane into a right turn, but it's too late. The 727 had already started its takeoff roll, and it was traveling too fast to stop. The 727 slammed into the left wing of the DC-9. The impact was so violent that it caused the DC-9, or what now remains of the DC-9, to face in the direction of the 727, a complete 180-degree turn. The 727 kept tumbling, and it scraped along the runway for 460 meters. Both planes were fueled for their respective flights, and now that fuel fueled an inferno. Both wreckages were burning. Everyone on board the DC-9 died instantly, and the violent impact was unsurvivable. 42 people on the 727 had survived. In all, 42 people survived the ordeal. Two planes should never be on an active runway. It's one of the cardinal rules of aviation. One airplane was not where they were supposed to be. The 727 had clearance to take off and they were supposed to be on the runway. The DC-9 was supposed to be nowhere near the runway. To understand the mistakes that made the DC-9 to be on the active runway, we have to take a closer look at how the DC-9 taxied to get where it did. Airplanes get around an airport using taxiways. A taxiway is a paved surface that airplanes can use to get from point A to point B in the airport. Big airports are a maze of taxiways. Think how lost you can get in a massive mall. It's kind of like that. Each taxiway is given a letter so pilots can understand where they are. For the DC-9 to get to the holding positions for runway 01, it had to start, make 2 left turns, and then make it onto taxiway Juliet, which would take it straight to a 5-way junction of taxiways. From here, it's supposed to make a 90-degree right turn that takes it onto runway Oscar 7, but for some reason, they taxied onto taxiway Juliet 1 instead. Each taxiway has a line drawn down its middle, which helps pilots navigate on it. It clearly shows how turns are to be made. As the plane taxied towards taxiway Oscar, the pilot could not see the taxiway line of Oscar just yet, but he could see part of the center line branching off to join the center line of taxiway Oscar. Moreover, the plane taxied a bit to the right of the center line. Now they were at the 5-way taxiway junction. This was a mess of center lines, and in bad weather like this, it would have been hard for them to make sense of all the center lines. With them being off to the right and the bad visibility, the center line of taxiway Oscar was right in front of them at a 90-degree angle. This meant that they were right on top of the point where the bifurcation of taxiway Juliet joined taxiway Oscar, the point that they were looking for. Now, put yourself in the pilot's shoes. You're in really bad weather and you want to turn right onto a taxiway, and you see a taxi line on a gentle right curve onto a taxiway. That's probably why they taxied onto Juliet 1 and not Oscar 7. They thought Juliet 1 was Oscar 7. They hadn't thought the 90-degree turn was the right turn. From there on, Juliet 7 led to the intersection of both runway 01 and 33, the active runway. As they taxied along Juliet 1, nothing aroused their suspicion. There was a no entry sign right next to Juliet 1, but the thick fog obscured it. When they did get to the junction of taxiway Hotel 1 and Juliet 1, they thought they were here rather than where they actually were, which was here. From this point on, the captain thought the line from Juliet 1 to the runway 01 was taxiway Oscar-6, and he followed it right onto runway 01, an active runway. The weather on that day was especially bad. Pilots could not see much out of the cockpit. With the distance that they could see being so limited, it would have taken them a lot of time to realize that they were on a taxiway. The weather was so bad that it took them a few minutes to realize that they were on a runway. The edge lighting of the runway would have hinted to the fact that they were on a runway and not a taxiway. But they could only see one of those lights at a time, and that too only for a few seconds. By this time, the 727 had started its takeoff roll, and the accident was inevitable. The 2 wrong turns had put the DC-9 in the 727's flight path, and with the fog being this bad, there was no way that they could have seen each other in time to avoid the disaster. They had taxied into danger. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, please consider liking and subscribing. I'll catch you guys next time.